Welcome back to Moral Philosophy. In this lecture, I will be talking about moral relativism. We previously mentioned relativism and morals, and in this lecture, I'll look at just what moral relativism means and the arguments for and against it. So what is moral relativism? Generally speaking, relativism is a document that a particular property varies in relationship to something else, and therefore correct judgments about the property also vary. For example, the foods we like are a matter of relativism. We have no problem saying that Mary likes chocolate while John does not. So chocolate can be liked and not liked at the same time, but not by the same person. On the other hand, universalism is a doctrine that a property is the same at all times and in all places. An example here is mathematics. 2 plus 2 equals 4 no matter where I'm located or what year it is. Similarly, the laws of physics never change. Following these definitions, moral cultural relativism is the doctrine that morality is relative to culture. What is right or wrong could vary with the time and place that is being discussed. There are two kinds of moral relativism: descriptive and normative. Descriptive relativism refers to what people are actually doing, whereas normative relativism refers to what people should be doing. In this course, we are interested in normative relativism. We are interested in whether what is right or wrong truly varies by time and culture. Now, as presented in our book, moral relativism claims that X is right means that X is approved by one's culture, and X is wrong means that X is disapproved by one's culture. Thus, there is no absolute or universal standard of right or wrong. An act can be right in one culture when it is wrong in another. And it's important to note this means that the act is genuinely right or wrong. It's not that some cultures behave differently. Rather, relativism means that these cultures are correct in behaving differently. One is not better than the other. It's also important to remember that relativism is an objective theory. This means that there is a clear right or wrong in each culture. Everyone does not get to determine what is right or wrong. Rather, we can look at the culture to know what is moral or immoral. So that if you say a certain act is immoral in a certain culture, what you are saying can be true or false. It is not simply a matter of opinion. So there is no question that cultural relativism has many attractive features. First, we recognize that different cultures have different moral standards. This becomes even more obvious now that the world is so interconnected. And many societies appear to live very good lives even though they practice very different moralities. Second, we all want to think of ourselves as being open-minded and therefore want to avoid ethnocentrism, which is the practice of judging others by our own standards. As we've noted in this course, all people should be treated equally. If that is so, and we are no different from others, why should we have the right to criticize them if their moral practices differ from ours? Third, the idea of relativism promotes tolerance and understanding in interactions, something we all believe is important. And finally, there is no way to deny that our moral lives are shaped by our cultures. We grow up learning moral behaviors from our parents and the people around us. Each of us feels that these practices are very important to our lives, and we strongly believe in them. So it is easy to extend this thinking to the idea that each culture's practices have value and should be respected. Nonetheless, Despite all these attractive features, most philosophers believe that cultural relativism has significant flaws, and we're going to take a look now at why this is so. The first problem is that cultural relativism visualizes a world in which cultures are simple, homogeneous, and distinct or isolated from each other. We know this picture doesn't describe today's world. We can look around and see that many countries are comprised of different cultures. Next, many of us belong to multiple cultures. This is certainly true for families whose parents grew up in a different country, but it can also be true for others. For example, I might be a citizen of the United States, belong to a certain religion, and work on Wall Street. Each of these identities could pull me in different directions when it comes to making moral decisions. And finally, we recognize that there are many subcultures within a single pluralistic culture like that of the United States. This ambiguity leads to the problem that it is sometimes difficult to figure out what culture I should identify with. This problem is made even more difficult when I interact with people who belong to different cultures. How should we treat each other if our views about morality conflict, but each of our views is correct according to the beliefs of relativism? The second problem is related to the first, and it's the problem of cultural mobility. What should travelers, refugees, and immigrants do? The book cites the example of an American businesswoman who goes to Saudi Arabia, where the practices are very different and women are not allowed to act on their own. Should she believe that their culture is correct when she is there? Or conversely, what about a Saudi woman who comes to the United States and encounters the disrespect for women that often exists in our culture? There's a saying, when in Rome, do as the Romans do, and this might be fine on a short visit, but it's not the answer to this problem. If someone emigrates to a different society, how much of their culture and moral commitments should they retain? Should they be obligated to adopt the values of their new country? Cultural relativism does not provide an answer to these kinds of questions. A third problem is theoretical coherence. This is the kind of problem that philosophers love to talk about. You remember in the first module, we said that a good moral theory needs to be consistent. The problem here is that cultural relativism must accept ethical universalism as a valid theory because it must accept every theory as valid. So as the book asks, what happens if missionaries from an intolerant universalist culture, B, seek converts in a tolerant relativist culture, A? And to make it more difficult, suppose culture B has a number of abhorrent beliefs, like slavery being acceptable. As good relativists, the people in culture A cannot criticize the people of culture B because both have sincerely held moral beliefs. But does it really make sense that the people of A should stand by and allow an abhorrent culture to flourish? Some might say that the answer to this kind of problem is to declare that only relativist moral theories should be acceptable. But this is still incoherent because a relativist has no way to justify eliminating universalist theories. Thus, there is a contradiction in relativism, and such a contradiction raises serious questions about the theory's validity. The fourth problem is how one resolves cultural differences and conflicts. There is no moral basis for one culture to argue that another should drop its beliefs and be integrated. Some might say the only answer is to resort to violence. While we can see this happening in certain cultural and religious disputes around the world, are we ready to accept that this is the only solution to moral disagreements? A fifth problem is that relativism does not account for the internal dynamism of societies. We note that over time the morality of most societies changes, and we generally believe that it does so for the better. For example, a number of practices that were accepted in the past, like the denial of women's voting, slavery, and child labor, are no longer acceptable. And it certainly seems that our current practices are objectively much better. Yet relativism gives no support to those who want to reform a society until the majority approves. Do we really believe that the reformers who first advocated against slavery were advocating for an immoral act because their views were not yet accepted by society? The opposite is true. We admire them and believe that they were advocating for what is truly moral. But relativism has no way to explain this. The next problem is explaining the difference between practices that are customary and practices that are truly moral. Both kinds of practices are determined by culture under relativism, so on what basis can they be distinguished? We certainly believe that practices like capital punishment and gender separation are moral issues. They are very different from customs like what kind of clothes we wear and how we greet other people. Yet relativism does not provide a clear basis for distinguishing between these two kinds of practices. By not doing so, many argue that relativism undermines the seriousness of morality. If both kinds of practices are simply determined by culture, why should violating a moral practice be a more serious offense than wearing the wrong kinds of clothes? Well, we know a moral offense is serious, and we all take it to be so, but moral relativism does not provide us with a sound reason for why this is the case. The final problem for relativism is that it risks a slide into what is known as subjectivism. According to subjectivism, X is right means that X is approved by me, and X only applies to me. It doesn't apply to others because they have their own moral subjectivism. What constitutes approval? The key characteristic of approval is sincerity. If someone sincerely believes that what she is doing is right, then it is the right thing for her, at least according to subjectivism. Now, it's easy to see the problem if each person has his or her own morality. This magnifies many of the problems we just discussed, and the result is an abandonment of the idea of a moral philosophy. Each person simply does what she believes is right. Now, no one would believe that this is the way morality should work, but as we identify more and smaller groups and recognize each one's practices as being morally correct, relativism moves closer and closer to subjectivism and loses more and more authority. Thus, the theory of moral relativism has many problems, and most philosophers reject it as a theory. But you should be aware that there are philosophers who believe in the theory, so we must understand and consider it. Now let's go back to the case of the honor killing that was introduced at the beginning of Chapter 3. Several key assumptions are required in thinking about this case. We must assume that the breach of an arranged marriage is a serious dishonor, in certain cultures, and that an honor killing is the obligatory response. We also need to assume that the culture of Shafalia's parents in rural Pakistan is a viable one. If we accept these assumptions, then it is reasonable to conclude that what her parents did is morally right in their home culture. Now, the problem is that Shafalia was not raised in that culture and does not identify with it. She sees herself as English, and her family has chosen to live in England. So to what extent does that obligate them to adopt English customs and morals? This case presents a problem that relativism really can't address. The parents are acting morally in their culture, but their actions are clearly immoral in the daughter's culture and that of their new homeland. To try to resolve these kinds of problems, many philosophers have asserted that there is a principle of basic human rights that takes precedence over all moralities. According to this view, what the parents did was wrong. However, we must note that this view of a transcendent set of rights needs to be grounded in something, and it is clearly not consistent with a belief in cultural relativism. So for me, the main purpose of this case is to highlight a kind of problem that moral relativism simply cannot solve. So what is the answer? On the one hand, contemporary life supports the idea of relativism. For example, we have rejected imperialism or the idea that certain cultures should be dominant. We are also concerned about cultural approbation, in which a larger culture adopts some of the customs of another and turns them into commodities. And globalization has made us aware of the differences in culture. Finally, philosophers have introduced ideas about contingency and moral ambivalence. By contingency, we mean the recognition that we could have been born in a different time and place. And if that had happened, we would be just as committed to the culture and the values of that time as we are to the ones we have now. Moral ambivalence refers to the fact that we have come to know and appreciate other cultures and their differences. The more we appreciate them, the harder it is to argue that they are wrong. So a lot of what we see today supports the idea that relativism is real. On the other hand, we have just seen that relativism leads to serious issues. My biggest concern is that it does not give clear direction on how to treat people of different cultures. And this is an increasingly important issue in today's interconnected world. One solution that has been proposed is called moral pluralism. This could also be termed nuanced relativism or pluralistic relativism. Under such an account, there is still diversity, but acceptable moral systems need to endorse the same essential core principles. Thus, every moral system is not automatically acceptable. For example, all moral systems must respect human rights, forbid cruelty, treat all races and gender equally, and so forth. These kinds of core principles should not vary between societies, but practices outside of the core can. Of course, there are definitional problems as to where the core ends and variability is permitted, but the overall concept is still sound. Accepting moral pluralism does require completely abandoning relativism. And the question arises on what grounds we can justify this view. We justify relativism by pointing to the difference in various cultures. So how do we justify moral pluralism? One answer is that we ground the universal values of moral pluralism in certain aspects of human nature. We all share common characteristics such as needing each other, wanting to care for our families, not wanting to be hurt, wanting to help others, and so forth. These characteristics can be the basis of a set of moral principles that apply to everyone. Thus, moral pluralism allows us to conclude that there is a universal morality, but it only applies to the core moral issues rather than to all moral practices. Now, if one accepts moral pluralism, there is still an issue of where to draw the boundary between universal core practices and those outside the core. What happens to serious moral issues where there is disagreement, like abortion, capital punishment, and euthanasia? My view is that these kinds of issues are part of the core, but we have not been able to determine just what is right and what is wrong. They are like slavery or women's rights many years ago. At that time, there were sincere arguments that, for example, slavery was moral, but these arguments no longer have credibility. Under this view, the moral core includes issues that are not yet resolved. There is a correct universal answer to these issues. We just haven't found it yet. So that's an introduction to moral relativism and the issues surrounding it. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have, and I'll see you next week. Thank you.